Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and thank you again for your patience. This is a webinar that the LISC Institute decided to put on to focus on just like the change in the community development landscape. And we have our guests, Bob Zdenek and Dee Walsh, who was able to take a look and draw upon interviews with 12 diverse longtime leaders in the sector. And in their interviews, they identified a number of common themes that were related to leadership and what inspired these leaders. So we thank both Bob and Dee, and then also some of the leaders that have joined us this afternoon to share more about their journeys. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Bob and Dee. And just let me know when to navigate the slides. And everyone else, you're on mute. If you're having issues with audio, please select the dial-in number so that you can hear. But yeah, we're ready to go.
Good. Thank you, Amani. Dee and I are delighted and want to thank LISC for sponsoring this webinar on community development leadership, early visionaries, inspiring tomorrow's success. And over the past year, we had the pleasure, and it was really fun, I interviewed 10 longtime distinguished leaders, 2 of whom are on this call, and Dee interviewed several, and one of hers is on this call. So why we wrote this paper that was published in November by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco is that we really wanted to do a historical perspective, focus on leaders that had led organizations for at least 20 years, and really watched the field evolve, and it contributed significantly to its development. And so looking also at different leadership styles and approaches. In a way, these people, some of our 3 participants, and I'll introduce them in a second, really help build a field and a movement, and that they have advice to guidance for future leaders. And so that's what we're going to spend a lot of the time today, having our 3 leaders share their wisdom and experience. And we're fortunate, we have leaders in different stages. We have with us Peter Carey, who was the former president and CEO of Self-Help Enterprises out of Visalia, California, the largest rural affordable housing developer in the United States. And Peter played a pivotal role in the growth of Self-Help, which is over 50 years old. We have Robin Hughes, who's the president and CEO of Abode Communities, still very into leadership and has been with the organization for many years and can share her experience and insights building the organization and relevance for current leaders. And last but not least, Marty Johnson, who's the founder and CEO of Isles, Inc. out of Trenton, New Jersey. And Marty's actually going through a transition right now. He's founded Isles 39 years ago, and so they're in the process of hiring a successor. So different stages of leadership we have. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dee Walsh to talk about some of the leadership. I should mention we identified at least 10 leadership themes, and we're going to focus briefly on those leadership themes, and they're in the PowerPoint. So I'm going to turn it over to Dee right now.
Amani, could you forward it just one real quick to the next one? Just one other thing I wanted to add in terms of why Bob and I decided to write this article is that a couple of years ago, a couple longtime leaders in the field died, and Pete Garcia from Chicago's Pro Causa and Barbara Smith Battle, they from LA. And we were like, wow, there's all these amazing people who have been with the sector for so long. We really need to do something to capture their stories. And I will say that there are easily 75 longtime leaders across the country, probably more, that would be worth interviewing. But unfortunately, Bob and I both have day jobs, and so our time was limited. We tried to pick 12 that represented both rural and urban, East Coast and West Coast, and also diversity and type of organization, race, and tenure. And so that's how we ended where we did with the interviews. So if you could move to the next slide, Amani. As Bill mentioned, in interviewing all these folks, there were several common themes that came up, or characteristics, reasons why people got involved in the community development sector and why they stayed. And one of the first common themes that we found in interviewing everyone, that all of the leaders had a keen interest in social justice and human rights. And that was really one of the initial motivators for them getting involved with the work. It's a little bit different today where a lot of people entering our field are coming out of graduate programs in community development. But back in the day, those kinds of institutions didn't exist, and people got involved because they saw a challenge that needed tackling, and there was no one trying to address it, and so they just rolled up their sleeves and jumped in and learned as they did. In doing that, they really learned the value of community engagement. If you're trying to do community development and address issues in the community, you've got to talk to the folks that live there, the businesses that are there, the institutions that are there. So all of our leaders stressed the value of engaging with the communities that you work in. And I think today sometimes we get so busy with all the technical and regulatory aspects of our job that sometimes we can forget about that really core important attribute. We also found that all of our leaders were both strategic and courageous in their leadership style. They were strategic in terms of how they navigated their organizations to get things done, and they were courageous in that they were calling to question issues and problems that weren't easy to address. They were also, in most cases, a champion of place. They picked a geography that they focused on. What was interesting is that for most of the leaders that we interviewed, that geography was adopted. They didn't grow up there, and there's one exception to that, and that is Robin Hughes, who still works in South LA, in addition to other parts of California. But everybody embraced the place that they were working in and had a really strong connection to it. And finally, I'll say that all of our leaders had a strong instinct for policy. While this work is a lot about doing projects and programs and deals, if the policy winds blow in a direction that hurts your work, you've got to be able to mobilize and address it. And all of our leaders stressed the importance of being involved. Some had experience working in policy in public office positions, for example, Peter Carey, and he can talk a bit about that, and Robin Hughes also. But others did it from more of an activist standpoint. So with that, I just would like to open it up to our three leaders who are on the phone and just ask, which of these themes resonate with you, and how do they relate to your experience? Peter, do you want to start?
And Peter, if you're talking, we can't hear you. You probably mute yourself.
Yeah, I think you're on mute, Peter.
There you go. Okay.
Okay.
Clearly, the themes all resonate. The organization I worked for was founded by the Quakers, and so its basic premise was social justice and rights. But over time, I think that there are two that jump out at me. The value of community engagement. We worked throughout the San Joaquin Valley in probably 100 different communities. Our stock and trade was families building each other's houses, but that idea of engagement reached all the way to city councils and neighbors and ways to buy the community into the challenges we were facing in building affordable housing. As my career moved on and the organization strengthened, I think my main role was as a champion of place, and not specifically just the geography we were in, but rural in general. In the 60s, out of sight sort of meant cool, but in my experience in rural America, out of sight described how rural was treated by most of the decision makers, Sacramento, Washington, et cetera. And so a lot of my effort went into bringing rural into the policy and decision-making levels in those venues.
Thanks, Peter. Robin, could you share your thoughts?
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Wonderful. So, I agree that each of these resonates with me, and sort of thinking about it, it's probably at different stages of my leadership here. at Abode Communities, I think what drew me to this organization at the time was the value of community engagement and really having community and housing development come up as a very neighborhood issue and a neighborhood need with people in the neighborhood supporting and organizing around it. And it's probably something that I wish we could do more of today. And the work that we do, that we are so often focused on getting projects done, that this ability to really engage communities and bring communities along has taken a back seat. But it's truly what drew me to this work and to this organization in particular. I would say that the policy instinct, although I started my career in local government, I think how to be an influencer and leader in the policy arena probably came later in my tenure here at the organization. And it's such a critical part of the work that I do, that we do, influencing policy that has direct benefit for our organization and our work, but it's also about having system changes and deep policy changes for the industry as a whole. And I think that's a really important part of leadership in the community development and housing world.
Thanks, Robin. And Marty, over to you.
Yes, thanks. So I think that I tend to look at the history of our last 39 years as kind of hybrid outcomes. So if I'm looking at the value of community engagement, I understand why we have to remind ourselves about that engagement. It's really important for a variety of reasons, including the fact that you get better quality information to decide what to do and how to do your work. But for all those folks that say that all the wisdom is at the community level, I think that's also not true. I think that there is lots of wisdom at the community level, but there's also lots of wisdom that comes in from being able to assess best practices, look at data, look outward, and then it's that collision of community engagement and thoughtful intervention of outside data and information that really cool stuff happens. And it's hard for organizations to do that. And that's sort of where we've gotten to as an organization, having to feel good about the collisions that are going on, both around ideas as well as connections to people and resources. So that guides some of our strategy, and I think the courage that is really key. It's important to be virtuous, but the most important virtue by far, I think, is courage. For me, it's to be courageous, to not be too enamored by either the outside smart people from like institutions who have the best practice analysis, or too enamored in the other direction as well. And so that requires championing place, but in our world we have had a lot of tension between place being local and regional. And increasingly, the older I get and the more the organization engages this work, we have become more regional in the way we think and who we're connecting to. And that does lead us down the policy path increasingly, because it's a different community at the regional level than it is at the local level in really segregated communities like here in New Jersey.
Great, thanks. Let's move to the next slide, Amani, and over to Bob.
Okay, well, thank you, Dee, Peter, Robin, and Marty. That was really some insightful discussion. And I was going to actually just, before I talk about the themes, when we talk about policy, this instinct for policy, we largely found in the interviews and reflecting on that it was proactive. It was creating new, or really taking challenging strategies and positions and really advocating for them. So that was what we really meant by the instinct for policy. There are 4 additional themes, and it's not meant to be exhaustive, but first one is the ability to balance priorities and institute good business practices. And in a way, that our leaders were very mission-driven, but they also stressed the critical importance of good business practices, systems, capacity. That helps you really grow. So it's balancing priorities and good business practices, being effective and inspirational. So we saw that as a consistent theme. And several of our leaders on this phone call were great examples of that, and then I'll ask them to talk about it in a couple minutes. The next one, which sort of builds from that, is this notion of good governance representation. Marty alluded to a little bit in terms of the local, regional, but what we really saw is combining community vision with thought leadership. As organizations got more larger, complex, it was keeping that sort of engagement and grounded vision, but at the same time bringing thought leaders, people from the outside or active in the community that could really help think through and come up with a strategic direction. And sort of one of my favorite quotes is from the what I call the late, great George Knight, who was the longtime executive director of then Neighborhood Reinvestment Corporation, and told me one time, he said, nations fail because of the wrong strategic decision. And then he said, CDC board of directors need to make strategic thinking and decisions the top priority of the organization. And I think that's really accurate as you evolve as a more complex and impactful organization. Then the next one, not surprisingly, is the growing importance of collaboration. Again, I love collaboration. I mean, I value the importance of collaboration. And Dee and I wrote a book on it called Navigating Community Development, but I didn't necessarily lead with that. And inevitably, the leaders that I interviewed, 10 of them, brought added collaboration as a really key element and really a skill set, an attitude that's increasingly important, and their own leadership evolved that way, so that whether they're currently in the organization or they've left their organization, they talked about some of the strategic partnerships and collaboration and the growing importance of that in community development. And then the last one, which I hadn't really thought about until we reflected on the interviews, was the need to nurture youth in the next generation. About half of our leaders started out doing youth development work, and this was really critical. And it's really at the heart of this field. And I think of community development as sort of we're in the people business, developing and growing leaders, people, staff, residents to have more control over their life and to really advance community economic development. So how do we expedite the next generation of leaders? So one of the things I did at NCCED was the Emerging Leaders Program. Was the last thing I did was launch it. So this notion of leadership and nurturing youth. So those were the other themes that we identified. So I'm going to reverse order. I'm going to start with Marty and ask him to talk about some of his experiences and insights around the four themes that I just laid out.
So starting with balancing priorities, it's interesting to me because I've been teaching the last 5 years in university settings, and currently at Lafayette College, I'm teaching social entrepreneurship. And one of the things I do first class is to describe the three main players in our game in community development. And those three players are beneficiaries of our work, management of the organizations, and funders, and the powerful gatekeepers. Inordinately, the funders have a lot of power, a lot of biasing capacity to make our work as managers of organizations change and be biased towards a lot of different types of work and approaches. And our ability to balance those three priorities. So if you think about, I call it a control model where the funders are in control primarily, but our holy grail, our goal is to have a shared agenda where all three players, funders, managers of organizations, and beneficiaries are on the same level and on equal plane, holding each other accountable and sharing the values as well as then the measures, so that, that to me, and that's how I teach students, is to keep that in the forefront. That is our goal. And that is not always easy to do, right? Because that means you have to have an alignment of your board and beneficiaries and funders, and how hard is that to get everybody in the same room even? So that to me is, for what we try to do in terms of good governance in support of that vision is we have a board that's broken into thirds. A third of our board represents those we serve, the beneficiaries. A third represents technical folks, lawyers, accountants, others, and then the third are ambassadors, or connecting us to people, organizations, money. And then we have a pipeline committee of our board that works with us to decide what to do, how to push our work through a pipeline up towards an influence agenda, which is where ultimately we want to do good work on the ground, but we really want to be able to influence others too. So that to me is a really key element, and one that fascinating to look at organizational behavior dynamics and how it gets taught. I think that there are a lot of reasons why those of us on this call have got to grapple with the messiness of that control model and how hard it is in some ways to keep our eyes on the prize. Finally, the youth the leadership theme is one that is important to us, not just because that's our future, but it's because we work with young people. We run an Isles Youth Institute. We work with kids who dropped out, train them in the construction trades, and they engage in work on the ground. But they provide us with really open-minded feedback on what we're doing and why we're doing it, and that's really early level information that for us really helps having them involved.
Good. Thank you, Marty. Robin, want to share some examples and insights?
Sure. So again, when I look at these themes, I think about the evolution of my role here in the organization as the president and CEO, and how the organization has changed and grown over the 20-plus years. And, I recall when I grew up on the development side of my organization, and when I came back as the president and CEO, it was still all about production. So I was leading a production organization. And then, 5 years into the job, I realized, okay, I'm really no longer a developer. My role in the organization has changed, and I have to think about how do I balance our priorities, which was production, and best practices, and began to create structure. We went from a 10-person organization to, a 100-person organization very quickly, and that meant we had to look at operations differently, governance differently, things like that. So it's and if I sort of track that over the next decade, each time there's a growth or evolution in the organization, these things around balancing priority and practice and best practices and governance become even more critical. So I'm really proud of where we are now as an organization, and that we have built the infrastructure that we need to continue to have deep impact in the work that we do. And in terms of collaboration, we could not be successful in doing the work that we do if we did not lead, and I mean that for myself and for my leadership team, with an approach of collaboration. We have to work. We work with our communities. We work with government. We work with just the general public, and so it's really important that part of our leadership throughout the organization is that focused around collaboration. It's one of our corporate values as well.
Thank you, Robin.
And I will say my thought about nurturing youth. I think very early on in my career, I felt like it was really important that I go back to the local universities here and speak about our work, because not often do people in college think about coming out and doing this work in the community development field. And I think it's because of folks like myself and others who engaged academia in the region that we have really great real estate programs now that are, most of our staff have come from local real estate programs here in LA. So developing that future of community development leaders is really important.
Robin, that's a great point about sort of engaging academia, and I know that all of you have, and many of our leaders have, and that's really how the pipeline build the field. So, Peter.
Right.
Peter, do you want to share your experiences and insights? You on mute?
Self-Help Enterprises. When I came out here in 1974, I came as a VISTA volunteer to stay a year, but I was drawn by the mission of the organization. I was drawn by the fact that it was an organization that really did things in communities, and I was overwhelmed by the need of the area, largely farmer communities. And so I came in I was hired at the lowest level in the organization and worked my way through a variety of positions. But at that point, the organization was largely sort of based on the social service organization model coming out of the war on poverty. and I was really frustrated by the lack of focus on limited resources and the need to be as efficient as we possibly could using the resources we had, including dollars and time. So, sort of I became driven by the idea of instituting stronger management and business practices. And there was a lot of tension over that because I think everybody can appreciate the tension that exists between mission and business that we all face, especially in developing or building. And yet, recognize that tension. I decided to make that tension sort of a hallmark, and rather than talking about it causing problems, I talked about the fact that tension and stress really can build things. That's how you build muscle. And that, I believe, is how you build a stronger organization. So we really focused on the existence of that tension and worked to implement stronger management systems, better financial records and systems for the mission in order to carry out the mission. In the early 80s, I don't think self-help enterprises had more than $100 of unrestricted assets. And that really undermined our ability to be independent and make our own decisions and also to sustain in the world of development. So we set out to increase our assets and grow those assets. So for the first 20 years for me as CEO, I became CEO in 1990, that was the driving force, was maintaining business and mission side by side. It was in later parts of my tenure that I began to see the importance of collaboration externally, which sometimes competes with the need to be more competitive in the environment. And so that another source of tension, which can be very positive, I believe, is sort of balancing the need to compete for resources with the need to collaborate on a broader level.
Good. Okay. Thank you, Peter. Dee, do you want to add anything?
Amani, if you could go to the next slide, and just, Bob, we've been reminded to move it a little faster because we want to leave some time for questions at the end. Okay, thank you.
Okay, next slide. So what I'm going to talk about real briefly, and then have our leaders elaborate, is that through this process, we started thinking about phases of leadership, and we thought of 4 phases. Now, this is not meant to be completely linear, but there's clearly evolution here. And the first phase is the strong visionary entrepreneurial leader, the person who either founded, in the case of Marty Johnson's an example, somebody who was a founder, but came in early and really developed vision and saw the challenge and came up with some opportunities. Second phase is where you begin to build capacity, staff. You begin to be the leader more as a coach, mentor, and developer of staff. The third phase, and Peter actually sort of talked about it when he took over CEO of Self-Help, is the institutional phase, is the systems, the broader engagement, the leadership, and it's really institution building around systems and strategies of the organization. And then through these interviews with these visionaries, we saw really a phase 4 to it, which is really influencing and impacting the community development ecosystem. Again, not every leader gets to stage 4, but it's really having broad impact, whether it's throughout the Central Valley or New Jersey or the LA region, broader impact and influence that these organizations and leaders have brought. So just wanted to ask them quickly, does this framework resemble your leadership path? And if not, what did you experience and what helped you along your path, your leadership path, and what resources made your growth possible? So let's start with Peter.
Well, that's interesting. I think that organizations do tend to go through that transition, but I also think that the leadership has got to, in some ways, embrace all of those aspects. And I think that As an organization gets bigger, that leader may be off on the right side of that slide, but somehow or other that organization needs to maintain an entrepreneurial spirit that keeps it alive and energized.
Robin?
So this slide definitely reflects my tenure here in the organization, I think I would agree this first part of being a visionary leader continues to thread through these other phases as well. I think that's one of the important and driving points as a leader in this field for our organizations to be successful. So I often say that in my 24 years now and in being in this role that I probably have had 4 or 5 different jobs, and I think these phases clearly reflect that. I will say that perhaps the current phase that I'm in now, which is the one to the far right, the way that I feel like I've been able to achieve this is because of the infrastructure, the system, but mostly importantly, the staff that are now in place for me to sort of elevate my leadership role to this level. And in particular, having a really strong COO here that can oversee a lot of the operational components of the job so that I can be a much more external leader for the organization.
Yeah, that's definitely phase 4 too. Marty?
Yeah, for me, this is certainly not a linear process because all of us have to evolve. I can understand why the phasing is this way, and I can see where in the aggregate or in the larger picture, most organizations go down this path. But I really needed to get through phase 1. I needed to be thinking pretty strategically about the issues in phase 4. And that was how I was able to organize the organization's theory of change and approach because it was going to be more than just a problem in front of our faces. And so to some degree, I needed to make sure that we were looking at the system change, we were looking at the scaling possibilities and how it might be replicable. In the academic world, we talk about social entrepreneurs that are really effective as having an opposable mindset, which means that you can see what's in front of you, but also be able to connect to the broader system around you, kind of like the forest and the trees analogy. And not everybody can do that very well. And so I imagine in the future, we're going to be seeing so much more collaborative and networked leadership that these phases are going to change. This probably is true of the last 30 years, but I think if you start now, this is going to be rewritten a bit as management theory and practice is changing.
Yeah, that's an evolving piece of work. Thank you. That's very insightful. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pivot and talk about future-proofing your organization. I'm going to turn it back to Dee. And Amani, the next slide, please.
So we're going to just zip through some of the conclusions we came to after talking to the leaders and listening to what they thought about needed to be done going forward. And then after we get through these next 3 slides, we'll open it back up again for our leaders to comment. So I stole the expression future-proofing your organization from some colleagues of mine in England, and I thought it made a lot of sense to think about if you want to be effective in the future, what do you need to do now to make sure that you're prepared and situated correctly? We believe from the interviews and our experiences that we're going to see significant changes related to public investments, tax policy, healthcare, criminal justice system, environmental stewardship. And all of these things may cause us to redirect our focus as leaders into new areas of work. And we need to be prepared for these shifts. I think there's going to be a greater focus on collaboration and innovation going forward. In order to be effective, we're going to have to attract diverse perspectives so that we can really ensure that we're addressing things soundly. And this is especially important with the impact of climate adaptation and economic and racial inequality. A couple years ago, when I was working at the Housing Partnership Network, I hosted a member meeting that was focused on climate change and community development. And some people ask me, why are we talking about climate change? I don't think anyone in the community development sector would ask that question today, and that's just 4 years later. So there are these issues that are bubbling to the top that we're really going to need to start paying attention to. And then, as with the last few years, data and technology will continue to play a growing role, both in informing how we do our work and how we deliver our services and programs, and also how we document our impact. Next slide, Bob.
Yeah, and sort of building upon Dee's point about collaboration is this notion of envisioning and establishing multi-sector partnerships. We really bring diverse organizations together. And I've been observing over the past decade some really exciting new and diverse partners and leaders that are partnering with community development organizations. And the key is to support and lead, to be a resource, or some people call it a backbone or quarterback notion. But it's really to lead and add value, not necessarily dominate, and move forward with these complex initiatives. So this multi-sector partnerships is really growing significance in the community development and having the attributes and abilities to move them forward. And the next one is, it ties again to the data, is understanding the fundamentals of what drive investors. This field has always been heavily dependent upon external resources, even though more and more community development organizations have healthy fund balances and assets which enable them to generate internal revenue. But it's having the data and track record. In a way, for me, it's sort of the intersection of mission and impact. It's being able to share that and getting people excited about the vision and the significant potential and around critical issues that community development organizations are doing. Then the last one is excelling, or the last one I'm talking about, is excelling at forming key relationships and teams that respond effectively and quickly. Change happens quickly. Change seems to happen more quickly every year. And I think what this really speaks to is the importance of adaptation, or being able to adapt and being resilient with partnerships and teams. You know, being nimble, being able to move, but in a strategic direction. So those are three key elements we saw from our, we gleaned from our interviews and discussion with our leaders. So next slide. Back to you, Dee.
Thanks. So we talked a little bit about this before, but going forward, it's going to be incredibly important to be courageous, strategic, and resilient. You're going to be able to have to handle what's thrown at you, and you're going to have to put on a brave face even if you're not feeling brave. And then leveraging your core competencies. Bob and I talked a lot about this in our book on community development, and that is that we can't be all things to all people. We have to really be adept at finding good partners who have complementary competencies, and we need to manage and develop and empower others and work together so that we can attack these large-scale issues that we've been struggling against. Next slide. Next slide.
I thought we would have our participants.
Yeah, the questions are on the next slide.
Okay.
So we've listed several methods to future-proof your organization. I wanted to ask the leaders, does the list resonate with you? What's missing? And what do you see as the key steps for ensuring leaders and their organizations are successful in this future? So Marty, why don't we start with you?
As Bob said, this isn't theory for me. I'm in the middle of this right now, having to spend time with the board and our selection committee trying to characterize the leadership that we need as a successor. If any of you on the call are inclined, there's a couple more days where we're going to be accepting resumes, so feel free. In terms of future-proofing our organization, the things that come to mind immediately for us are the ways that our business model directly hinges upon our ability to raise about 18 to 20% of our money, which is somewhere in the area of $1.1 million. We have to raise that from unrestricted sources. And that is the beauty of our organization. That's what made it possible for me to be there for 39 years and to keep learning and stop doing things that we know aren't as good as other things and pivot and do new stuff and not be so reliant on the funder to buy us our work. So that required some relationships to get that kind of unrestricted money from about 1,000, 1,100 individuals. So that becomes a really important element to our success as an organization. We will try to reduce our reliance on that a little bit in my transition out. Expecting the new CEO won't have quite as many relationships, but that's got to be, we got to look really hard at that. And it also speaks to why we need to regionalize our work, not just because our theory of change would be stronger if we integrate all communities, including bring affordable housing, for example, into high-income communities, but it also puts us in relationship with resources that we wouldn't be in relationship with if we just kind of hung in high-poverty areas of Trenton, for example. From a cultural perspective, one of the things I feel really strongly about is that I teach the Aristotle project that Google has been working on over the last few years. It's fascinating to see they ask the question, what makes the ideal team? And the research there aligns with my experience, which is it's psychological safety. And it's our job as leaders to be able to create teams where everyone feels safe enough to be able to have a voice, to be able to push back, and to be able to have important, sometimes tough dialogue. It's particularly true in a highly racialized field like this. I'm a white guy. I've been working in communities of color this whole time. We've got to figure out how to talk about white privilege and the challenge of white leadership in so many communities of color around the country. And just finally, tactically, I'm trying really hard to keep my management team from getting too nervous about this process because they don't believe really that the board knows what it takes, and they believe that they know what it takes to run the organization, and there's a lot of truth in that. But the board needs to step up, and they need to feel ownership over this. And so that dance between the board taking this on and the staff saying, "Hey, involve us in the interviews," blah blah blah. It's been an interesting dance, but so far we've been able to make it work. We'll see how it goes.
I heard a few extra things that we need to add to our list there, Marty, including the importance of working towards financial sustainability, the importance of having a strong board that can make those important decisions, and really paying attention to racial equity. Robin, do you want to weigh in on this list?
Sure. So one of our responsibilities, especially as long-term leaders in our organization, is I think there are two things. One is to always to be thinking, 5 years ahead or 10 years ahead in terms of what's going to be happening in the industry and how do we do our work. And I think we have a responsibility for constantly looking out that way. And then secondly, I think it is making sure that we are building a sustainable organization that will be able to continue to grow and thrive when we leave the organization. And that means, making sure the organization continues to have a great pipeline in place. I think it's been touched on, a great leadership bench in place, a great governance body, and the financial health of the organization. When I think about the legacy that I want to leave here at Abode Community, it encompasses all of those things. Yes, we want to know that we've been impactful and had an impact in addressing housing affordability and homelessness in the areas that we work in. But I really want to make sure that I've built an organization that can continue to grow and thrive and continue to deepen that impact.
Great. Thanks, Robin. Peter?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on a couple of things that have already been said. And I think that for me, having been both in my own organization and also on the boards of a couple of other organizations, national organizations, I think that many organizations that have had the luxury of long-time leaders, I think sort of anticipate looking for the next long-term leader. And I'm not sure that will continue to play out in the coming years. I'm not sure that organizations will wind up with 20-year, 30-year leaders. And it concerns me that boards may not be learning the lessons that they need to learn when they go through the first long-time transition, that they're learning the lessons they will need sooner to be sure the organizations are equipped to handle the next transition, which may come sooner than anticipated. And I've seen that play out in a couple of organizations I know well. And the other thing I'd just say is that we as leaders need to recognize that our job is to build the organization, not our own position in it. And I think Robin was saying we need to leave a strong organization that does well without us, rather than an organization that misses us.
That's great advice. And I agree with you. I think the idea that the next generation of leaders are going to be in the job for 20, 25 years is probably questionable given just the work practices and habits of the younger generations in terms of how long they typically stay at one place.
Yep.
So next slide, Imani. And this is the last slide, and Bob's going to highlight it. And
Thank you, Dee. That was a really great discussion about sort of future-proofing and some of the challenges. And so we wanted to offer some recommendations. And first is that we'd like to do more of this work, more combination of interviewing longtime community development leaders and sharing what the leaders and what our experience is around leadership development phases, themes, attributes, et cetera. So there's sort of 5 quick recommendations before we go to Q&A. First one, which actually has sort of been happening, is developing training curriculum for new leaders. I would sort of say that it's adapting and learning from some of the existing training curriculum, comparing some of the notes on effectiveness. In California, where I've lived for 3 years, the California Coalition for Rural Housing, CCRH, has a really good internship program. It's about 20 years old, and leadership and development, and now other networks are adapting it in California. So that's building upon existing successes and practices around some of these curriculums, the regional and national level. The second one is creating a community of practice, and that's sort of the notion of bringing together emerging leaders with seasoned and longtime leaders and practitioners to help provide guidance around challenges, questions, opportunities. So it's this community of practice and how we do this, and we can do it with technology. I think face-to-face time is really important, but we also have the luxury of using technology that people don't have to come together every month, which gets very expensive. The third area is developing mentorship programs that build diverse leaders, and that's providing mentorship opportunities for young emerging leaders. But the flip side of it is also engaging some of our older adults who are longtime distinguished leaders who are really interested in and continue to be very thoughtful in terms of the future of community development. I'm hoping that Peter Carey's phone's going to ring off the hook after this call, and he'll have a lot of opportunities to mentor current and future leaders, and Marty and others, and Robin. And then the next one is additional research and leadership. There's some really opportunities around what are some of they're evolving. This field's dynamic. It's only 50 years old, even in its oldest, or maybe 55. But what are the competencies evolving? What are the leadership styles? I mean, if we looked at competencies 20 years ago, I bet half of them that Dee and I identified several years ago, would not have been on that list. So what are the new competencies of leadership? And then looking at the barriers and opportunities in promoting diverse community development leadership. Marty talked about some of the white privilege and other real challenges for white leaders and communities. There's also the issue, and Roberto Barragan, who's one of our interviewees, talked about it. In young emerging leaders of color often have more challenging financial circumstances. And so they can't necessarily take some of these positions that don't pay adequately or they have heavy student loan debt. It's not, most young people have, or millennials have student loan debt, but we have to be very deliberative in terms of how do we attract and maintain some of these young leaders of color in the next generation of the community development field. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Imani for the question and answers.
Thank you all. So for those that have questions, again, you're muted. We're going to try to get to some of those questions. Just put them in the chat or Q&A function. So the first question that actually came in, there was a board member from CDC in New York City in the Bronx, and they wanted to know if anyone on the panel can speak to any advice for their board on effectiveness with a new CEO transition and how to support that. So if anyone can speak to that, like lessons learned or things that the board should take into account.
So I guess I can talk to that since I'm in the midst of that as well. What I'm curious about is whether they're looking to secure a new person or looking for advice on that process, or somebody who's already been hired, how to onboard them. A couple quick things that meant a lot to me and to us organizationally. A lot of people have different beliefs about how these transitions ought to occur. There's lousy research on it overall, but the best research that I've seen in terms of how to transition from, especially from a long-term leader into new leadership, came out of Bridgespan, and I believe McKinsey was involved. They looked at organizations that were $3 million and up, and they found something interesting, that those organizations that took their time and had a participatory transition period that was extended, where either the founder or the long-term ED or CEO stayed with the successor over a period of time. There's a lot of folks out there that believe that you got to leave the organization if you're the founder and, eliminate the shadows of your presence so that the successor can come in and have the freedom to do what they got to do. Well, I think that research, you can find it on, I think it was published in Stanford Review. I think that was really helpful for us. I've spent 5 years, half-time, at our organization in preparation for this transition so that the system could kind of react to me not being there. And so I think it's going to be that much easier for us to find a successor because of that.
Other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, my advice would be, especially as a board member, that two things. So one, that the board is in alignment regarding their expectations of the new leadership, so that the person in the role is not getting conflicting information. And the board, through the board president, is sort of supporting that new leader in their role. And I will also say that the board has to do this really interesting balancing between probably an immediate response of wanting to go back to that early stage of organization where they're more engaged in the operations of the organization, so to resist that desire and to give that new leader the autonomy and independence that he or she needs, but having the right checks and balances in place.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's certainly a tough balance for a board to provide the leeway the new leader should have while nonetheless maintaining a objective enough look at things to make sure that things are going well. I think the issue of engaging the prior leader, I think, really should be negotiated between the new leader and the board. And the other thing I'd say is that there's got to be a commitment by the board to the success of the new CEO.
Right. This is Imani.
Real quickly.
Go ahead, Marty.
I was just going to say real quickly that we tend to hero worship. And so one of the things I really hope our board does is spend a lot of time with the management of the staff that's going to remain. They're a really good team. We've got great folks, and that relationship, they need to be as collaborative as we talk about being collaborative as managers. Boards need to do that, and not and a number of these recommendations here, some of them kind of move towards hero worship, and we need to be careful of that.
Thank you. Okay, so Dee and Bob, if you're comfortable with me assigning questions to people, just so that we can just get one answer per per
That's
question?
fine.
Okay, great. So there is a question about retention of staff and line staff. So I am going to pose that to Robin. The question was just any advice for retention of line staff.
Sorry, I was on mute. I guess we will probably all agree that getting the right people in our organization and sustaining it over time is always a challenge. I sort of feel like I have come late, and we have come late as an organization to really focus on our human capital in our organization. So we are right now in the midst of doing a human capital plan for our staff. But I think giving more focus to how we attract, retain, and develop our team is really important. But it's a challenge, but it has to be a priority for us as an organization.
Thank you for that. I believe Peter had mentioned the point about debt, and correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, if you did, but if you didn't, excuse me. But there was a question about engaging youth and middle agers that are in debt, and if you had any thoughts on like a vision for that, and how to, I guess, carry that forward.
That was not me.
That was Bob.
Okay.
That was me.
That was Robert.
Well, Bob,
Robert,
do you have any thoughts there?
No, the point I was just stressing was that organizations need to build into their sort of calculus in terms of attracting diverse leaders that it may cost a bit more given the current financial circumstances. And so part of leadership development is not necessarily helping them erase student debt, but being able, they may need a higher income, a salary, that they can deploy some of those resources towards family issues, student debt, et cetera. Just calculated, being conscious of it.
And this is Peter. I will say that at our organization, we created a program to help repay student loans.
Thank you.
Good example.
And I'm just being mindful of time, so I will pose one more question. There was a question about the greatest disappointment. Sorry to end on this note, but so the greatest disappointment in your tenure and your leadership, and I will pose that to Marty.
Wow. I've had some really great disappointments that have taught me a lot and taught all of us a lot. So probably it was the time that we spent, we were encouraged by the state government and others to expand our capacity to renovate houses for energy efficiency and health. And we created a subsidiary, invested in the ramp up, hired a bunch of people, ran it for a few years, but then in some ways we were taken on by some of the organized labor interests who we've partnered with on policy stuff around the state and had a lot of relationships with, and they wanted to do this work themselves. And so we ended up having a high-level, painful battle with our allies. So it's oftentimes not your enemies that get in the way, it's your allies. And we learned a lot in that process, and we're actually moving back into that arena now, but it's 8 years later, and still smarting a little bit over that fight.
Thank you for that. And for those that sent in other questions that we weren't able to get to, what I will do is just share that with Bob and Dee so that the panelists can, provide some insight. And, I'll share that in the follow-up just of the recording so you have it as a resource for you. And then also, Bob and Dee, if it's okay to also share the deck, because people wanted to use this as a resource and also collateral for speaking with their boards and also their respective organizations. So thank you all for joining, and we greatly appreciate your insight. We look forward to more conversation.
Thank you so much for hosting, and thanks to all the speakers.
Yeah, they did a great job.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.